Hello! So whilst my son and I were playing with this Thomas the Tank Engine tracks, I noticed that at one point, with the tunnels and the tracks, we'd actually created what looked like a nerve cell. So I decided I might try and recreate a nerve cell for you, specifically a motor neuron, using this track and tunnels in order to explain how it all works. So let's go and have a look. Okay, so this is kind of like the start of the nerve cell, all right? These little things that are sprouting out from the main cell body here are called dendrites, okay? And here we go, we've got a little label for you there, dendrites. And at the ends of these dendrites in the cell wall are different receptors and channels. So there might be sodium channels, chloride channels, potassium channels. And when neurotransmitters arrive at this dendrite, they cause these channels to open, or some of them to open, some of them to close. So on this occasion, if we imagine that maybe sodium channels have been opened, so sodium is going to start rushing in. And bearing in mind there is a cell wall all the way around, the whole lot, a nice cell membrane all the way around, and there's sodium and potassium channels and sodium potassium pumps in all of this membrane around here. Okay, so sodium's going to be travelling down. When a higher voltage reaches some of these channels, which are voltage gated, so they respond to different levels of voltage. So the sodium's going to be coming down, the higher voltage is going to activate more sodium channels. So as it comes down, the voltage is going to be increasing as more and more sodium starts to pour in. And the same from these other dendrites as well. Okay, loads of sodium is going to be starting to pour in to this cell body. And in the cell body, you've obviously got a nucleus in the centre of the cell with organelles in it. So as the voltage in here is increasing, it then funnels down into what's called the axon, which goes through here. Okay, so we can have a bit of a look down the axon there. All right, and where it funnels down into the axon is known as the axon hillock. All right. So you'll notice on here, the axon is actually covered up by a lot of these little tunnels, and these tunnels are representing what are called Schwann cells. Okay, and in these Schwann cells is the myelin sheath. Well, the myelin sheath, when it wraps around, and it's a little bit like a tube of kitchen roll in terms of it wraps around in a really big sort of tight spiral and becomes thicker and thicker and thicker, which means that it's going to be insulating that axon from voltage, in fact. Okay, and what we want is to maintain this voltage. Now, as I said, there's obviously sodium and potassium channels. There's also sodium potassium pumps in the cell wall as well. Now, in terms of how we would like the cell to be laid out, ideally we want sodium to be on the outside of the cell and potassium on the inside. Okay, but obviously, as you know, sodium's been let inside the cell and is increasing. So these sodium potassium pumps that are in the cell wall are trying to pump all of the sodium back out again and allow potassium to come back in to try and repolarize it back down again. Now, that can't occur when these Schwann cells are around the axon, so the voltage just maintains it at a high level whilst it's there. Maybe some of it will then be leaked out in these little sections here that are not surrounded by a Schwann cell. These gaps in between are known as nodes of Ronvier, okay, in between the Schwann cells. Okay, so as the voltage is increasing, it's going to be travelling down this axon. Now, when it reaches a certain voltage, all of the channels, all of the sodium channels will suddenly open and there'll be a mad rush of sodium into the cell. So with that high voltage, the impulse will go very, very quickly down this axon. When it gets to the end of the axon, which is this little bit here, that's the axon terminal, okay, where it terminates. And then you've got the start of another neuron, and you'd probably recognise this shape from earlier, and this is the dendrite of another nerve cell. And where the axon terminal ends and the dendrite of the next nerve cell starts, that is known as the synapse. Okay, so this is where the synapse is. And there are loads of these synapses all around the body, millions and millions. Okay, so on here you've got what's known as a presynaptic membrane and a postsynaptic membrane. Okay, and this gap in between, they don't actually touch. This gap in between is called the synaptic cleft. Okay, so at the end of this axon terminal, neurotransmitter will be released into this synaptic cleft, and the neurotransmitters will then bind on to certain receptor sites in this postsynaptic membrane and then allow maybe more sodium channels to open, and then the process repeats itself. And that's really quite basically how this all works with the aid of sometimes the tank engine track and tunnels. Thank you for listening.